Chapter 1. The Silhouette in the Moonlight. The Pine Barrens were never quiet. At least, not in the way forests should be. Even on windless nights, the thickets whispered secrets too ancient for words, and the soil always smelled of damp rot, like it remembered things that crawled far beneath its roots. Tonight, though, the woods were holding their breath. Under the bloated, blood-red hunter's moon, the clearing looked like an open wound cut into the wild. Skeletal trees circled the open patch of earth like mourners, their branches clawing skyward as if begging for deliverance. The moonlight bled down onto the frost-bitten grass, casting everything in shades of rust and ruin. A herd of deer stood motionless in the clearing, dozens of them, locked in unnatural stillness, like statues carved from flesh and fur. None twitched an ear, none blinked. They all faced east, eyes locked on the swollen moon that loomed just over the blackened tree line. They stood like pews. That was the first thing Ethan Mercer thought as he stepped softly through the underbrush, crouched low, his boots barely whispering against the cold soil. Pews in a forest chapel, reverent and waiting for communion. He swallowed hard and raised his camera, snapping 3 photos in quick succession. The shutter didn't even make a sound. They'd all be infrared. He could study them later. Now he had to observe. Ethan was used to strange things in the woods. 20 years as a tracker and folklorist had taught him that the wilderness held more than just wildlife. It held memory, myth, and sometimes madness. He'd come to the Barrens following a pattern. Animals ripped apart without bite marks, twisted in ways that defied anatomy. Locals whispered about the devil, but he didn't believe in monsters. He believed in predators, and whatever was out here, it wasn't hunting for food. It was staging. Suddenly, every deer's head jerked upward in unison. Ethan froze. The herd stared skyward, eyes wide, necks craned. A low, guttural moan began to rise, not from the deer, but from the wind itself, as if the forest was exhaling something it had been holding in too long. Branches above trembled, though no breeze passed through. Then he saw it. Outlined against the moon was a shape, immense, wrong. The wings stretched out like torn leather canopies, jagged at the edges, twitching spasmodically as if they were too large for the body they dragged. The creature hovered just above the treetops, its silhouette pitch black against the crimson orb. Its head was horned, the tips curling in opposite directions like twisted iron wrought in hell. A tail lashed behind it, forked and spiked. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed briefly, a sulfuric yellow that bored into Ethan's chest. Then it blinked out of existence. No flap of wings, no gust of air, just gone. The deer bolted, every single one of them. They scattered into the brush with frantic bleats, leaving behind only trampled grass and steaming dung. Ethan remained rooted to the spot, heart jackhammering in his throat. From the trees ahead, he heard it. Drip, drip, drip. He crept forward, every muscle screaming against instinct. The clearing narrowed into a hollow, sunken slightly, and surrounded by thick pine. And there, dangling from a split branch like a grotesque ornament, hung a mutilated buck. Its body was upside down, splayed open from sternum to groin. Its innards had been pulled out and draped methodically over the branch, like garlands. Intestines looped in neat coils, the liver pierced by a splinter of wood. The legs had been bent backward until the bones snapped, the joints forced into unnatural angles. Its head hung low, the tongue cut out, eyes gouged cleanly from the sockets. Blood dripped steadily from the rib cage, pattering onto a bed of moss below that was already dark with previous stains. Ethan gagged, turning his face away, but his camera was already up again, trembling in his hands. He forced himself to take the pictures. This was evidence, This was ritualistic. This was a message. He circled the grisly scene slowly, noting the absence of predator marks. No tooth indentations, no tearing at the flesh, just clean incisions, surgical and deliberate. The heart was missing, and in its place, nestled inside the chest cavity like some kind of altar, was a bird skull. An owl, maybe, its eye sockets filled with polished river stones. And then he saw it. Just beyond the clearing, on the bark of a gnarled old oak, were claw marks, 4 deep gouges raked downward. Each mark was thick as his thumb, sunk nearly an inch into the wood. Ethan stepped closer and measured with his hand. They started 8 feet off the ground. No bear did this, no mountain lion, no wolf. And if it was a hoax, it was one done by something or someone with strength well beyond human. Somehow Pitska Chemica, author no known. End of the 8 heroes. End of Pitska Chemica by Alfred N. A gust of wind passed through the trees, whistling low like a dying breath. The blood on the moss rippled. Somewhere in the dark, far beyond the reach of his headlamp, came a wet, slithering sound. Ethan backed away from the oak tree, keeping his eyes locked on the claw marks. His breath came in quick bursts now, clouding the chilled air. The forest wasn't holding its breath anymore. It was breathing him in. Chapter 2. The Devourer's Trail. The town of Leeds Point was a skeleton of itself, a scatter of clapboard houses and sagging porches, surrounded by a bristling sea of pitch pines. Ethan Mercer pulled his hood low against the cold dawn wind. The air was sharp with the scent of iron and swamp decay, and every board under his boots creaked as though the place resented the weight of strangers. He'd spent the night in his truck on the outskirts of town, unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the buck again, dangling upside down like a grotesque ornament, its ribs yawning open to the moonlight. Now the sun rose weakly, a sickly, pale disk that did nothing to burn away the mist curling between the houses. The people here were just as spectral. Faces appeared briefly behind curtains, then vanished. Conversations ended when he approached. The Pine Barrens were no stranger to myth, but this was different. Even the locals looked like they had been marked by the woods. He found the man he was looking for on the porch of a condemned general store, a wiry figure hunched over a thermos of coffee, skin like sun-baked leather, eyes red-rimmed. His name was Harold Sloane, though everyone just called him Hal. He'd been hunting in the Barrens for 50 years, and when Ethan mentioned the deer at the clearing, Hal's hands started to shake. "I told him," Hal rasped, his voice like gravel dragged over glass. "Told him the woods ain't right no more. The hymns started first, thought it was some church group out there. But there ain't no church for 15 miles. Voices carry weird in the Barrens." He looked up at Ethan, eyes wet and unfocused. "They're not people's voices. They're wrong. Too low, too many mouths singing at once." Ethan leaned closer. "You said something about the deer?" Hal nodded, clutching his thermos like it was a talisman. "I seen it last week. Moon was fat and orange and sittin' like a yoke over the trees. I'd come to the clearing by Cedar Run and they was all there, standin' on their knees like prayin'." His lips trembled. "They didn't even blink when my flashlight hit 'em. Just staring at something I couldn't see. Like the sky was a pulpit." The old man's voice broke. "Then they screamed, all at once. Deer don't scream, boy, not like that." Ethan scribbled furiously in his notebook. "What happened next?" Hal looked away, jaw tight. Something moved between the trees. Big. Wings blacker than the night. It hissed like steam. I ran, left my rifle behind. Ain't gone back since. The words hung between them, heavy as stones. Ethan had heard plenty of local legends, but Hal's eyes weren't telling a story, they were remembering. He changed tactics. "Do you know anything about a colonial town that disappeared? Some kind of massacre during a hunter's moon?" Hal's head snapped toward him. "Where'd you hear that?" Ethan produced a yellowed photocopy from his bag, a fragment of a diary he'd uncovered at a state archive. The handwriting was spidery, slanted with panic. October 13, 1735, it read. "The child walks, the sky bleeds. We were told to kneel. Those who did not are gone. The horned thing collects its pews." Hal recoiled like he'd been struck. "You shouldn't be messing with that. That's Leeds blood you're stirring. Folks here don't talk about it for a reason." But Ethan couldn't stop. The pieces were aligning. The diary matched Hal's account almost word for word. That afternoon, Ethan followed the hunter's trail into the pines, GPS and compass in hand. The farther he walked, the more the forest seemed to fold around him. The trees grew denser, their needles black and slick with dew. Mushrooms clustered on the roots like white tumors. The air smelled of copper and ash. A mile in, he found it. The cabin was a ruin, half swallowed by the earth. Its roof sagged under decades of moss, and its windows were black hollows veined with cracks. A single door hung from one hinge, groaning as it shifted in the breeze. Ethan pushed it open, and a wave of rot and mildew rolled out to greet him. Inside, the dim light revealed a nightmare of symmetry. The walls had been stripped of boards in places, exposing the ribs of the house. Along these ribs, nailed in a perfect circle around the single room, were deer heads, dozens of them, antlers splayed like crowns. Each muzzle had been crudely sewn shut with black thread, lips puckered and torn where the needle had passed. Their eyes had been removed, leaving cavernous sockets stuffed with pine needles. A crude altar had been built in the center of the room, fashioned from stones stacked in a spiral. Atop it sat a rusted tin basin full of congealed blood. The stink was unbearable, sweet and metallic. Flies droned lazily above, too bloated to move. Ethan raised his camera with a trembling hand. The flash lit the room like lightning, casting the sewn mouths into momentary grins. He snapped photo after photo, every click echoing off the nailed skulls like a hammer on nails. Then he noticed the floor. Carved into the wood beneath the altar were symbols. Circles intersected by claw-like marks, a crude depiction of a horned figure with wings. Beneath it the words, "The pews kneel, the child feeds." His stomach turned. This wasn't just ritual. It was history repeating itself. He fled the cabin, lungs burning with the stink of death, and stumbled back toward the trail. Dusk was settling in, the sky bruised purple and red. Somewhere far off a crow cawed once, then fell silent. When he reached the marsh where he'd first met Hal the day before, the world felt wrong. The mist was thicker now, curling low across the water like crawling fingers. His boots sank into the mud, sucking with each step. Then he saw the shape. At first it looked like a broken scarecrow slumped against a cypress tree. But as he got closer, his gut tightened. It was Hal. The hunter's body was twisted into an impossible arch, back bent until the spine had snapped, head hanging loose at an unnatural angle. His eyes were gone, sockets wet and red. From his chest jutted two massive deer antlers, driven clean through his ribs from opposite sides, crossing like a grotesque crucifix. Blood had streamed down to pool in the marsh water, turning it black in the dim light. His mouth was sewn shut with the same black thread. Ethan staggered backward, bile rising. Above him, a branch creaked, though there was no wind. Something heavy shifted in the mist, unseen but near. The reeds around him trembled as if something enormous had just exhaled. The hymns began softly at first, low, guttural, too many voices to be human. They seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then, in the last light of day, Ethan saw movement at the edge of the marsh. 2 glowing points, yellow and low to the ground, staring at him through the fog. They blinked sideways, not like any mammal's eyes. The hymns grew louder. Chapter 3. The Red Pews. The sun bled out slowly, dissolving into a bruised sky. Ethan staggered deeper into the Pine Barrens, his boots crunching over frost-stiffened leaves. The air felt thicker tonight, as though it were clotting around him. His backpack jostled with every step. Inside, his camera, recorder, and a flash drive full of evidence. Evidence of things that shouldn't exist. Al's crucified body was still burned into his mind. He'd left the marsh in a half-run, choking down bile. But he couldn't bring himself to leave the forest entirely. It was as though something had taken hold of him, dragging him forward despite the dread that gnawed at his bones. The woods darkened unnaturally fast, the sky turning the color of old scabs. Ethan clicked on his headlamp, the beam slicing through the mist. Pine needles glimmered wetly, and every shadow seemed to breathe. He felt watched, not just by eyes, but by the very trees. And then he smelled it, copper and rot, sweet and wrong, like a slaughterhouse doused in incense. He slowed his pace, crouched low, and parted the branches ahead. The clearing opened before him. Ethan froze. The deer were back, or what remained of them. Dozens of corpses stood upright in a circle, lashed to sharpened stakes hammered into the ground. They had been arranged meticulously, all facing inward toward the center of the clearing. Their bodies were stiff, their legs nailed to the posts to mimic kneeling, their heads forced downward in a grotesque parody of prayer. Strips of skin hung from them like tattered robes, ribs cracked open and wired into place to resemble clasped hands. At the very center of the circle rose a tree unlike any he'd seen. It was gnarled and black, its trunk split into 2 thick limbs that twisted upward like horns. Branches curled out like claws, each draped with entrails that swayed gently, though there was no wind. The bark was slick and red as though it were still bleeding. Beneath it, the soil had been churned into mud, a pulpit of earth and gore. The smell was suffocating. Ethan stepped forward on shaking legs, his camera already out. He snapped photo after photo. Each flash cast the pews into momentary sharpness. Stitched lips, empty sockets stuffed with pine cones, tongues nailed to foreheads. Some were still fresh, their blood soaking into the cold dirt. Others had begun to rot, fur sloughing off in greasy clumps. A low noise rose from the base of the horned tree, a wet gurgle like something drinking deep below ground. Ethan backed away, breath rattling. The words from the diary echoed in his head. The pews kneel. The child feeds. He stumbled to the edge of the clearing and crouched behind a bush. His hands trembled so hard he nearly dropped the recorder. He flicked it on anyway, holding it out like a crucifix. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy. Then the whispers began. They came from nowhere and everywhere, sliding beneath his skin, slithering into his ears. Voices, dozens of them, low and sibilant, speaking in a language that felt like teeth scraping bone. Ethan clamped his palms over his ears, but the whispers burrowed deeper, threading through his thoughts like worms. He blinked, and the clearing shifted. For an instant he saw, not the Pine Barrens, but a burning church, its steeple a black finger stabbing at the moon. Flames poured from shattered stained glass, and children screamed inside, their voices singing in rhyme even as their faces melted in the heat. Kneel for the child, feed the child, bleed for the child. He gasped, and the vision snapped back to reality. His heart pounded, his headlamp flickered. The whispers ebbed, but the smell of smoke lingered. Night fell fully then, the blood-colored moon rising fat and low between the trees. Its light bathed the clearing in rust and shadow. Ethan hunkered low, clutching his recorder. That was when it came. A scream split the night. Not an animal scream, not even a human one, but something layered, like a choir of mouths shrieking in unison. It vibrated through the soil, through his teeth, up into his skull. He pressed the recorder tighter, his thumb white on the button. The sound warped the air. The corpses on the stakes trembled as if trying to bow deeper. When the scream cut off, the silence was worse. His ears rang. Ethan stumbled back to his truck, hands still shaking, and plugged the recorder into his laptop on the passenger seat. He hit play. The scream emerged again, but now flattened into a digital graph. Frequencies spilled across the screen, jagged and sharp. He watched the numbers climb higher and higher until they vanished off the scale. The software glitched, stuttered, then crashed. It wasn't a sound any living thing should be able to make. He wiped sweat from his brow and looked back out into the forest. The full moon had climbed higher now, staining the mist crimson. The trees seemed taller, their branches arching like the ribs of a cathedral. And then he saw movement. Above him, clinging to the pines like bloated bats, were shapes, winged and long-limbed, crawling upside down along the trunks. Their silhouettes were broken things, talons dragging, tails curling, heads jerking like marionettes. One of them tilted its horned head toward him. Yellow eyes blinked sideways. Another hissed, a sound like steam escaping a coffin. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His recorder, still plugged into the dead laptop, flickered once on its own. The hymns began again, low, guttural, closer now, and the shadows crawled lower. Chapter 4. Baptism of Bone. The forest had changed. It no longer resembled the Pine Barrens Ethan had been walking through for days. Now it was a maze of blackened trunks and crooked paths that twisted back on themselves like intestines. He had been walking for what felt like hours, but the moon above had not shifted once from its position. It hung there, low and swollen, like an infected wound in the sky, its red glow casting every shadow long and sharp enough to cut. His compass spun wildly in his palm, the needle trembling in a mad dance. GPS was useless. Even his watch had stopped, the second hand frozen at midnight. He felt like an ant scuttling across the belly of something vast and sleeping. The pine needles underfoot were slick now, as though soaked in old blood. The deeper he went, the more wrong the trees became. Bark peeled away to reveal something like bone beneath. Roots pushed through the soil like exposed veins. The air was warm and wet, humming faintly with low vibrations, as though the entire forest was breathing around him. He pushed forward, throat tight, until the trees parted and he stumbled into a clearing. He froze. Thousands of them. They formed spirals on the ground, some small and tight, others large enough to walk through like labyrinths. Skulls of deer, coyotes, and unidentifiable creatures were arranged with obsessive precision, eye sockets filled with river stones, jawbones cracked open and wired together. The spirals converged at a central structure. It rose 3 stories high, a grotesque cathedral assembled from death. Vertebrae were stacked into pillars. Femurs formed arches overhead. Rib cages had been strung together like stained glass windows. Tanned deer hide stretched taut between them to catch the moonlight in pale, translucent sheets. A spine ran up the center like a twisted steeple, crowned by a horned skull far too large to belong to any natural animal. The church was exactly as the colonial diary had described it. A chapel built of sin and bone, for the child to feed within. Ethan crept forward, drawn in despite every warning bell screaming in his mind. The smell was overpowering, a mix of copper, decay, and something sweet like rotten fruit. The ground was slick, and his boots left dark streaks wherever they touched. Inside, the nave stretched impossibly far, its ceiling a tangle of ribs and hide. Rows of pews had been fashioned from jawbones, vertebrae nailed together and lashed with sinew. The altar was a massive slab of stone stained black, surrounded by carved symbols, circles, horns, and figures of kneeling people with their heads bowed. Candles made of fat burned with greenish flames, casting flickering shadows that moved differently than the firelight. He stepped closer to the altar. His hand brushed the surface. It was warm. A sound rolled through the church, wet, low, and massive, like the stirring of something in deep water. Ethan spun, heart hammering, and saw movement at the far end of the nave. It emerged from the darkness with a sickly grace. The devil, the Jersey devil, the Leeds child, whatever the locals whispered, it was real, and it was nothing like the sketches or folklore. It stood twice as tall as a man, its body a patchwork of horrors, goat legs ending in claws that sank into the bone floor, a torso hunched and slick like burned leather, wings like black sails sprouting from its back, veined and twitching. Its head was elongated, horned and crowned with a mass of curling antlers. Its mouth was a vertical slit lined with needled teeth, and its eyes were pits of glowing sulfur. Its tail lashed behind it, tipped with a bony barb. It sniffed the air, the sound wet and animal. Then it shrieked. The scream was a wall of sound that struck Ethan physically, knocking him to his knees. His ears filled with blood. He scrambled backward, but the devil lunged, moving impossibly fast. It struck him across the chest with one clawed hand, throwing him against the altar. Stone cracked. He gasped, trying to crawl, but the creature was already on him. Its claws pinned his arms, its breath hot and stinking of rot. It lowered its head until the tips of its teeth hovered an inch from his face. Then it spoke, not with words, but with a dozen voices layered over each other, echoing from every wall of the church. Kneel, feed, bleed. Its claw pressed against his sternum. Pain exploded through his chest as the tip burned into his flesh like molten iron. He screamed, the sound tearing his throat raw. A sigil, 3 interlocked circles around a horn, seared itself into his skin, the stench of scorched flesh rising to his nose. And then, just as suddenly, the creature recoiled, wings snapping wide. It hissed and retreated into the darkness, vanishing between the pews of bone. Ethan lay gasping on the altar, clutching his chest. The mark throbbed with an unnatural heat, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He staggered to his feet, half blind from pain, and stumbled out of the bone church into the open air. The moon was fully crimson now, bigger than he had ever seen it. Its light bathed the clearing in bloody radiance. He heard chanting, low, rhythmic, and human. Turning, he saw figures emerging from the trees. They were townsfolk, men, women, children, all in tattered colonial garb. Their skin was pale and slack, eyes milky and unfocused. Black thread sealed their mouths into macabre smiles. They moved in perfect unison, kneeling as one before the bone church, hands clasped like parishioners awaiting communion. Ethan staggered backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Of them, on the steeple of vertebrae, the devil perched like a monstrous priest, wings unfurled, its antlers scraping the sky. The stitched-mouthed congregation raised their hands as one, and the devil opened its mouth, releasing a sound that was not a roar, but a hymn. Chapter 5. Communion of the Damned. The crimson moon loomed directly above the bone church, its light pressing down like a weight of judgment. The clearing was no longer just a structure of horror, it was a temple. And Ethan Mercer, marked and bloodied, was no longer a man lost in the woods. He was the offering. His chest still smoldered where the devil had burned the sigil into him. The flesh bubbled, oozing a black resin that refused to clot. His vision swam. Yet somewhere through the pain, through the fog of fever and dread, the truth had settled into him like a splinter to the bone. He was the final sacrifice. The townsfolk, those impossibly still figures kneeling in their rotted colonial garb, had not blinked, not shifted, not breathed. Their mouths, cruelly sewn into smiles, stretched wider now as if aware of his epiphany. Their heads slowly turned in unison, eyes milky and dead, yet somehow full of longing, of devotion. They were waiting, not for salvation, for the slaughter. And above them, perched on the altar of bone, wings unfurled in mockery of divinity, the Jersey Devil watched him. It dropped down from the steeple with a wet, heavy thud. Its hooves cracked bones underfoot as it landed. The wind died. The moonlight thickened. The forest around them shrank away, like the world had pulled inward to this single spot, this single moment. Ethan gritted his teeth, backing away. "Why, me?" he gasped, voice raw. "Why now?" The devil tilted its monstrous head. When it spoke, it was not one voice, but hundreds. Whispers, cries, guttural chants, and distant screams layered atop each other in maddening harmony. You wear the mark. You walk the trail. You feed the myth. 3 centuries of silence have grown hungry. Its wings stretched, blotting out the stars behind it. The air tasted of ash. They made a pact, blood for silence, worship for absence. But pacts rot, and blood thins. The pews emptied. The hymn ceased. You brought the story back, and now you must complete it. Ethan felt something within his skin twist, like his blood was being stirred. The sigil on his chest flared, brighter than fire. He dropped to his knees, howling as pain flooded his spine, his skull, his very thoughts. In the center of the church, the altar pulsed with a heartbeat. The skulls lining the pews clattered in rhythm, and around the spiral of bone the congregation began to sway, not walking, not breathing, but shifting, like puppets beneath invisible strings. "Fuck. You," Ethan choked out, crawling toward the altar. His hand brushed something inside his jacket. The lighter. He pulled it out, flicked it once, twice. The flame flared. The devil paused, head cocking, its expression unreadable. Ethan staggered to his feet. He stepped forward and with the last of his strength shoved the flame into the dried deer hide stretched between the rib cage supports of the church. The skin caught instantly. Fire raced up the bones like it knew its purpose. Greasy smoke billowed into the sky. A groan, deep and guttural, rolled through the forest, as if the church itself was dying. Skulls cracked open, spilling ash. The altar split down the middle. The devil screamed, not in pain but in fury. The voices inside it crescendoed into a discordant roar. It launched toward Ethan, claws outstretched, maw yawning wide. But the fire reached the steeple, and the entire church exploded in a plume of bone and black fire. Ethan was thrown backward, hitting the ground so hard the world went silent. He woke in embers. Ash rained down like snow. The bone church was nothing but a scorched crater now, twisted remains glowing with dying light. The sigil on his chest had stopped burning. His skin blistered and blackened, but the pain was distant now, muted, buried beneath a thick film of exhaustion and horror. He pushed himself up on shaking arms and looked around. The congregation was gone. Only, not entirely. In the tree line just beyond the edge of the fire's reach, they stood. Dozens of them. Silent. Staring. The townsfolk. Their mouths were still stitched into smiles, but now they seemed looser, like something behind the flesh was trying to grin wider. Their eyes glinted with pale fire. And beside them, at their feet, knelt the deer. Dozens more, still bowing, their heads lowered in reverence. Ethan turned and limped into the woods. He didn't look back. Not until the trees thinned and the moonlight faded into pale gray dawn. He collapsed beside the road, soaked in ash, skin scorched, throat raw. He would tell the story, warn someone, anyone. But as the light of the hunter's moon finally bled out of the sky, a shadow stirred in the distance. High on a cliff above the barrens, silhouetted against the rising new moon, something stood, tall, winged, and crowned with horns. Watching, waiting. The cycle had ended, but it had also begun again.